The room stopped listening before the meeting officially began. Logan Whitmore had already closed his notebook while my risk summary was still open on the screen. Half highlighted, unfinished, inconvenient. His posture said the decision existed elsewhere. "You're not a cultural fit anymore, Karis." Logan delivered it calmly. As Chief Executive Officer, 9 months into the job, he had learned how to end conversations quickly. The words weren't followed by evidence, questions, or hesitation. A folder slid across the table, thick with tabs, prepared long before I arrived. There was no performance improvement plan, no warning, no accusation of failure, only a termination packet waiting for my name. I'd like to make a small note. The following story contains dramatized elements inspired by real workplace situations. Certain details have been adapted to emphasize ethical lessons and emotional impact. If stories like this aren't for you, please feel free to step away, take a break, and take care of yourself. I had spent 12 years as Director of Risk and Compliance Operations, managing more than 70 internal risk events and keeping the company clear of 3 federal investigations. None of that slowed him down. Logan smiled with professional courtesy, the kind that signals finality without responsibility. He spoke about velocity, alignment, fresh blood. He said the company needed people who moved faster and asked fewer questions. "This isn't personal," he added lightly. "It's just culture." I watched him while he spoke. He hadn't asked about the unresolved compliance flags behind me. He hadn't read the controls he was dismantling. Confidence had replaced understanding, and slogans had replaced documentation. I said nothing. Arguing would have implied uncertainty. And I had none. Silence felt heavier, more deliberate. I signed where he indicated, my hand steady, my name final. Human Resources stepped in immediately, gathering the pages as if speed could erase what had happened. Her voice stayed neutral. "We'll be scheduling your mandatory exit interview," she said, already entering notes. Logan looked relieved. He believed this meeting closed the matter. He didn't realize it had created a record that doesn't forget, doesn't soften, or disappear. Do you know, if you want 90% of the 8 billion people who've been treated unfairly to know they're not invisible, stay here with this channel. A single subscription can quietly carry this story to someone who needs it right now. I replayed the last 12 years in fragments. Not memories, but decisions. I once stopped the company from signing a $200 million contract after noticing a liability clause no one else read. I was called too cautious. Slow, difficult. 6 months later, the same partner collapsed under investigation. Exactly as projected. That pattern repeated more than once. Logan Whitmore arrived with speeches instead of questions. As the new chief executive, he reduced compliance reviews, merged oversight teams, and reassigned controls to people who smiled in meetings. He talked about momentum and trust. He said guardrails were fear dressed as professionalism. The people he promoted were described as culture fit. Though none had signed off on a serious risk assessment, Human Resources repeated the same phrase every time my name surfaced. Not aligned with new culture. It appeared in emails, meeting notes, and calendar invites that quietly excluded me. The wording never changed, as if consistency made it defensible. What unsettled me was not the phrase itself, but its precision. It was identical each time, down to punctuation. Someone had chosen those words carefully and taught others to repeat them. This wasn't judgment. It was scripting. By the end of the week, I stopped reacting and started listening. I wrote the phrase down exactly as it was spoken. Each repetition felt heavier, more deliberate. I understood then that language was being used as a tool, not a description, and tools, when documented properly, always leave traces, behind everything else. The exit interview room was smaller than expected, undecorated, efficient. A junior HR representative waited with a tablet, shoulders slightly tense, eyes trained on a checklist rather than on me. This was not a place for explanations. It was a place designed to process people quickly, quietly, and without resistance. She smiled with professional softness and opened the script. "This is just a formality," she said, as if saying it often enough made it true. I nodded and sat still, already aware that every word here mattered more than the tone used to deliver it. The questions followed a predictable order: dates, titles, reasons, outcomes. I answered briefly, neutrally, anchored to timelines and documented facts. No accusations, no emotional edits. 12 years reduced to sequences and confirmations, each response clean enough to stand alone. The HR representative tapped the screen after each answer. Relieved by my lack of friction, she expected frustration or defense. I gave her neither. Calm, in this room, was not kindness. It was leverage waiting to be noticed. When the checklist reached its final section, I asked one question, keeping my voice level. "This interview is classified as compliance recorded data, correct?" The words landed softly. The HR rep glanced up, then nodded, unaware of the system she had just activated. That confirmation was not dramatic, but it was irreversible. The interview file shifted automatically, tagged, time-stamped, and routed beyond ordinary HR storage. I thanked her, stood, and left, knowing the record no longer belonged to them. Nothing in my expression changed as I walked away, but the balance had shifted. What they considered closure had become preservation. The system does not forget tone or intent. It only remembers inputs, and I had just supplied one they could not delete, revise, or explain away later, especially when lawyers, auditors, and boards start asking where it came from and who approved the process that captured it. That question would echo longer than any protest I could have made in that room. Silence had done its work. Quietly, precisely, and permanently, in their own systems, without my presence. Required. If you want me to handle it this way, press the 1 key and continue following. 48 hours after the exit interview, I received nothing. No calls, no emails, no questions. That silence told me the system was doing what people never do. It was comparing records without emotion. The compliance engine reconciled my termination reason against 12 years of documented performance. The label "not a cultural fit" did not match evaluations, risk logs, or outcomes. There were no warnings, no corrective actions, no performance plans. The discrepancy was mathematical, not personal, once detected. The system flagged the file automatically. No manager approved it, no lawyer reviewed it, no whistle was blown. A rule triggered another rule, and the process advanced on its own rails. That was the part executives rarely understand. Systems do not need motives. The internal audit did not begin with accusations. It began with alignment checks. Dates were verified. Signatures were matched. Language was compared line by line. My exit interview transcript was preserved exactly as entered. Untouched. Unedited. Unforgotten. What surprised me was how quickly the scope widened. When one termination failed validation, the system looked for patterns. It searched recent records using the same phrasing, the same justification, the same approval chain. Not aligned with new culture appeared again and again. Each match expanded the review. Each expansion reduced human discretion. Compliance was no longer a department. It was a sequence. I wasn't notified. I wasn't consulted. I didn't need to be. Nothing about this required my participation. That was the coldest realization. Control does not always feel like action. Sometimes it feels like absence. By the end of the second day, the audit queue included other recent terminations, quietly waiting their turn. Different names, similar reasons, identical language. No one had accused anyone of wrongdoing. The system simply asked whether the records agreed, and when they didn't, it kept asking. It continued without urgency, without anger, without commentary, moving forward because procedures demanded consistency. Somewhere inside that architecture, my silence remained intact, recorded as fact. That was enough. It would always be enough. The process did not stop once initiated. It rarely ever does. By design, alone, relentless. By the third day, the tension reached Logan before it reached me. I heard about it indirectly, the way pressure always travels upward before it explodes outward. Meetings ran long. Voices carried through glass walls. Compliance was no longer quiet. Logan Whitmore demanded answers. Why is compliance reviewing HR decisions, he asked. Sharp enough to cut through protocol. He treated the audit like an insult, not a mechanism, to him. Systems were tools, not constraints. He ordered it stopped. That request went nowhere. Compliance did not answer to authority once a process was triggered. Legal explained it carefully. Choosing words meant to slow him down. Once flagged, we can't stop it. Counsel said, the rule was procedural, not optional. Logan reacted the way executives do when control slips. He blamed human resources. He questioned their documentation, their wording, their competence. He asked who trained them to use that language. HR defended themselves with policies he had signed without reading. Emails multiplied, calendars filled. Each attempt to redirect responsibility only expanded the paper trail. The audit did not respond to emotion. It responded to inputs. Legal kept reviewing. That was their job. And in the course of verifying approvals, they found something Logan had forgotten. His signature appeared on the termination authorization, not delegated, not assumed, signed. The room went quiet when that surfaced. Logan tried to dismiss it as routine. A procedural necessity. Legal did not agree. Your approval validates the stated reason. They said, culture was no longer abstract, it was documented. That was the moment resistance changed shape. Logan stopped pushing forward and started containing damage. The audit continued, indifferent to his frustration. I wasn't present, but I didn't need to be. The system had what it needed, and it was no longer listening to him. It moved on schedules, checklists, and archived records. Not ego. Every objection created more documentation. Every delay confirmed intent. By the time Logan understood that, the process had already widened beyond him, beyond HR, beyond anything he could manage with authority alone. The consequences were now procedural, permanent, and outside his control. Patterns emerged without anyone naming them. The audit progressed methodically, correlating termination reasons against roles, tenure, and function. Within 6 months, at least 5 senior employees had been dismissed for culture. Every one of them came from compliance, risk, or legal oversight. That was when my name began to appear repeatedly. I was no longer employed, no longer attending meetings, no longer accessible. Still, my work surfaced everywhere. My prior reviews, escalation notes, and closed investigations were referenced as baselines. The system treated my history as stable data, not opinion. Executives noticed the pattern before they understood it. Questions reached the board quietly, framed as governance concerns rather than accusations. Why were protective functions shrinking? Why were the same phrases used? Why did outcomes diverge from historical controls? No one answered directly. The audit engine did not pause. It linked exits by language, by approval chains, by timing. Culture was no longer a description. It was a recurring variable. Each repetition increased confidence, not suspicion. I watched from a distance, aware but uninvolved. There was no satisfaction in it, only recognition. This was how systems assert authority, not through confrontation, but through consistency. Board members grew uneasy as the implications surfaced. Risk exposure was increasing while safeguards were disappearing. Legal warned that regulators notice trends faster than companies do. Silence at the top felt heavier than any argument. The solution arrived dressed as caution. External auditors were invited under the banner of independent review. Neutral, reputable, unavoidable. Their mandate was simple: validate the process. Once they entered, the narrative changed. The findings would no longer belong to management. They would belong to record and records. Once shared, have a way of traveling far beyond the rooms that tried to contain them. That shift was irreversible, procedural, and quietly authoritative. revealing power not in people, but in systems designed to remember, compare, and escalate without permission over time. By design. Alone. External auditors approached the exit interview transcript the way they approached everything else, slowly. Literally. Without interest in intent. They read it line by line, matching each question to policy and each answer to documented procedure. One of them paused. "This question isn't compliant," she said. Tapping the screen, HR had asked for subjective feedback framed as justification, not reflection. Another auditor traced the phrasing back through templates and emails. The wording did not originate with HR. It had been edited. Logan Whitmore's fingerprints were subtle but present. An email directive, a suggested phrase, not aligned with new culture. It appeared exactly as approved. Legal noticed the inconsistency immediately. Executive influence on termination language. One auditor noted, "Clinically, my own words sat untouched beneath that structure. Short answers, dates, roles, outcomes, no accusations, no emotion. One line stood out. Ordinary at first glance, my performance evaluations remained consistent. That sentence anchored everything else. What about this? An auditor asked. She didn't contest the reason. Another replied. She didn't need to. The record does. They cross-referenced my transcript against policy requirements and prior cases. The contrast was unmistakable. HR had deviated. Leadership had intervened. Process integrity had been compromised. That realization changed the temperature of the room. What began as internal review shifted classification. We need to elevate this. Someone said. The audit level was adjusted, scope expanded, authority widened. I wasn't there to see it. But the effect reached me anyway. A quiet recalibration. My calm responses, meant to close a chapter, had preserved it instead. Evidence doesn't argue, it waits. And once recognized, it changes who carries the burden of explanation entirely. From that moment forward, the audit no longer asked whether something felt wrong, only whether it matched documented rules, signatures, and authority. That distinction shifted accountability upward, away from silence, and toward those who believed language could shield decisions forever without consequence or permanent record attached. I learned what happened from a board summary forwarded quietly, stripped of tone but heavy with consequence. Logan Whitmore stood before directors repeating the same argument he always used. Culture is subjective, he said. Insisting leadership required discretion. He framed judgment as vision, dismissal as evolution. Legal interrupted him, not when it replaces policy. The sentence ended discussion. Culture could guide behavior, not override written controls. The room shifted. Directors asked about exposure, precedent, timing. Answers were incomplete. What followed was not anger, but arithmetic. Counsel outlined potential claims, parallel cases, discovery risk, 5 terminations, similar language, central approval. One misstep multiplied into many. Settlement projections climbed quickly. Insurance coverage narrowed. Silence grew. Logan tried to reassert control. He argued speed demanded flexibility. He questioned whether compliance had become obstruction. The board did not respond immediately. They reviewed signatures instead. His signature appeared repeatedly. Authority changed hands without ceremony. Human resources decisions were reassigned pending review. Logan's approval power was suspended. He remained seated, present, but suddenly irrelevant. The systems he had dismissed were now defining limits. I was not mentioned as a person, only as a reference point. My records established normal. Deviations were measured against them. That distance was intentional. Facts carry more weight without witnesses. The conclusion arrived calmly. Legal recommended administrative leave to contain risk. The board agreed. No vote theatrics, no speeches. Just a procedural outcome, Logan was informed. Culture had been his shield. Process became his undoing. I read the summary twice, then closed it. The collapse was not dramatic. It was incremental, documented, irreversible. It unfolded exactly as systems do, step by step, indifferent to personality, no shouting, no apology, no rescue, just governance asserting itself. By the time news reached employees, the narrative had changed. Culture was no longer a vision statement. It was a liability measured, traced, and quietly neutralized without debate, drama, or the chance to spin outcomes later on. I heard the news the way these things always travel, quietly and late. Logan Whitmore had resigned for personal reasons. According to the announcement, no explanation, no defense, no farewell message, just a vacancy where authority used to sit. Human resources leadership changed the same week. Titles disappeared from directories. Interim roles appeared overnight. Policies were reissued with careful language, as if tone alone could restore trust. The company began rebuilding compliance from fragments it had dismissed too easily. Legal settlements followed, not dramatic judgments, just numbers moving from one column to another. Quiet agreements, confidential terms. The cost was significant enough to be noticed, but never described publicly as punishment. It was framed as resolution. I received a single email from counsel. No greeting, no signature flourish. One sentence sat alone in the body. We acknowledge procedural failures. It was not an apology. It did not need to be. Acknowledgement was sufficient. Procedure had finally spoken. They asked if I would consider returning. The question was polite, restrained, almost hopeful. I read it twice before closing the message. Some chapters only function if they remain closed. The company rebuilt compliance carefully this time. Layers restored. Reviews slowed. Documentation returned to prominence. It would take years to undo what speed had broken in months. That work would belong to others. I accepted a role elsewhere, advising organizations that preferred prevention over slogans. My name stopped appearing in their reports. That absence felt intentional, earned. Justice did not announce itself. It settled. It aligned records with outcomes. It redistributed consequences without spectacle. Logan's exit was framed gently. Our leadership rotated quietly. Systems were corrected. Nothing about it felt triumphant. It felt accurate, cold, procedural, complete. And that was enough. It closed without revenge or celebration. The balance restored itself through paperwork, oversight, and delayed consequences. That kind of justice doesn't raise voices. It lowers risk. It teaches quietly. I didn't need recognition, reinstatement, or vindication. Watching the system correct its own errors was enough. Some outcomes arrive without applause. They arrive correct, final, and immune to revision. It ended exactly as it should, with order restored and lessons learned, leaving nothing to argue, nothing to appeal, and no one able to pretend the process had failed. That mattered more than victory. I started a new role at a different firm, one that valued records over rhetoric. I didn't return calls or offer explanations. There was no revenge to plan. The system had already done the work. Policies corrected decisions, archives preserved truth, and outcomes followed naturally. You can remove a person from a role, erase a name from an email, or rewrite a narrative. You cannot erase an honest record once it exists. That was the lesson left behind. Clean and complete. They called it culture. The system called it evidence. Nothing else needed saying after that final. Undeniable conclusion stood, for a long time. I believed that doing the right work was enough. That, if you stayed precise, honest, and consistent, the system would protect you. This experience taught me something deeper and harder to accept. Systems don't protect people by default. They protect records, and people are only safe when their work leaves a truthful trail behind. What hurt most wasn't being fired. It was realizing how easily 12 years of quiet responsibility could be reduced to a vague phrase like not a cultural fit. That phrase didn't attack my skills. It erased my history. And that kind of erasure is what so many people feel in silence when their value is rewritten by someone louder, newer, or more confident, but not more careful. What saved me wasn't anger or confrontation. It was restraint. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself in the room where the decision was already made. I stayed calm long enough for the truth to stay intact. And that's something I hope stays with you. Sometimes the strongest response isn't resistance, it's precision. There's a quiet dignity in knowing your work stands on its own, in knowing that even if your role disappears, your integrity doesn't. You don't need to win loudly for justice to arrive. Sometimes justice arrives slowly, through process, documentation, and accountability that no one can talk their way out of. If you're listening to this and you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or quietly pushed aside, especially after years of doing things right, know this: your value isn't erased just because someone chose to ignore it. Truth has weight, and when it's recorded honestly, it lasts longer than opinion. Before we continue, tell me, where are you listening from right now? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of a moment you've lived through or are still carrying, please consider leaving a comment, liking the video, or sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. These stories matter because they remind us we're not alone. If you want more stories about quiet strength, dignity, and justice that doesn't need to shout, stay with us and subscribe. Sometimes the most powerful lessons are the ones told calmly because they're true.